All right, Alabama Moon by Watt Key. He is the author of this book. He spent, from what I understand, he spent a whole bunch of time actually living in the woods, building a cabin on his own. And when you hear the descriptions of what it's like to be in the woods, they're so colorful and so vibrant and well worded that it really does a good job of almost bringing you into the woods yourself. So I love his writing style. I love how descriptive he is. I also love the woods. And I'm a little jealous that he got to do that and then write a really awesome book about it afterwards, or incorporate some of those things that he saw in the woods into this really awesome book. It's probably a better way to say it. So when we left off, we're on chapter 21. In chapter 20, Moon, Kit, and Hal hear a dog coming up after them, and they hear Sanders yelling and swearing and shooting his gun off, and this giant, big, slobbery dog comes running up behind him. Moon's ready to fight him, and the dog jumps on him and starts like licking his face all over, and Moon's like, come on, get off me, get off me. And then on top of that, Moon, Hal, the dog takes a liking to Hal, and so the dog's like following Hal everywhere Hal goes, bumping into his legs, slobbering all over him, and Hal's kind of like, man, stupid dog, get off me. But he also at the same time is okay snuggling with the dog while the dog's like laying on his chest while they're laying down resting for a little while. So we got Sanders is on the move looking for the kids. They have Sanders's dog. That dog, his name is Snapper. He belongs to Davy Sanders, and Snapper is now hanging out with the kids on their escape in the woods, which is kind of funny. Chapter 21. Late in the afternoon, the air became chilly again and we put our jackets on. I could tell that Hal and Kit were getting tired of walking, so I slowed and did a better job of clearing a trail for them. They seemed to find new energy when we came to a creek that poured over a small waterfall into a pond. They followed me to the bottom of the waterfall and walked around the edge of the pond. You two can rest now if you want. Sanders won't come back today. Hal looked at me like he was about to say something, but didn't. Kit and Hal spread their blankets in the grass and lay down to rest. After taking a long drink, Snapper plopped down beside Hal and shut his eyes. I looked at the sun and judged that there would be a little more than 2 hours before it would get too dark to see. The forest grew quiet, as it usually does late in the day, and a few clouds moved over us and cast shadows on the trees. The sides of the ravines sloped up to small embankments that edged a hardwood bottom. I took the knife and went in search of a hickory tree. I didn't have to travel far before I found hickory nuts on the ground and looked up into the trees until I saw hickory leaves. Wrapping my legs and arms around the tree, I ratcheted myself up until I could grab the lowest limb. I swung myself into the tree and balanced with one arm against the trunk. I cut a straight branch that was about as big around as my wrist, and I dropped it to the ground. Back at the pond, I shaved a smaller growth from the hickory branch until I had a pole about 6 feet long. As I whittled a barbed point on the end, Kit woke and watched me. Hey, go find a dry piece of wood. Dead wood, Kit. Kit nodded and stood up. He began walking and then turned back. How will I know if it's the right kind? Find a piece on the ground that's about as big as round as your leg and 2 feet long. If you can break it against the tree, it's dead. Be quick. It's going to get dark soon. All right, now, Living Out in the Woods 101. Survival mode. What is the most important thing that you should do if you're ever stranded alone in the woods? Some of you are probably thinking, make a fire. Some of you are probably thinking, find some food. Not a bad idea, especially around lunch and breakfast time. I'm sure Hal would appreciate some food. The absolute most important thing that you have to do is build or make a shelter. Shelter is top priority because you can gather food later. If you have some fresh running clean water, which sounds like they're pretty close to some clean water that they can drink. Water is important. You can only live a couple days, 2 to 3 days without water. You could live couple of weeks, maybe even a month without food. So you got time for food. Shelter is top priority because if you are exposed to the elements, you could go into hypothermia. You could die pretty quickly and have a pretty miserable time without a shelter. So shelter, priority number one. If it were me, I'd probably go shelter, possibly fire. That way I could boil the water if I find some water that I can use. So those are some top priorities, but really in that order, shelter's top priority. Let's see what Moon does. Kit nodded and hurried away. I set the hickory pole down and grabbed one of the small branches I'd shaved from it. Using a shoelace, I made a tiny bow. By the time I finished, Kit had returned with the deadwood. What are you making? Making a fish spear. Kit sat across from me and watched as I took another of the small branches and shaved a straight stick as long as my arm and as big around as my thumb. Wrapping the bowstring around my small stick, I made a drill to use against the deadwood Kit found. After I drilled a small dish into the wood, I told Kit to go pull some bark from a dead cedar tree I had seen up the hill. He stood once more and took a few steps in the direction I pointed. He turned and looked back at me. It's a furry-looking tree, I said. How can you not even know what a cedar tree looks like, Hal said, disgusted. Kit and I watched him stand from where he'd been sleeping. Come on, he said, sighing. I'll show it to you. I used the cedar bark they brought me to kindle the fire from the heat made of the tip of the bow drill. Kit and Hal watched quietly while I hardened the pointed tip of the spear into the flame. What about smoke? Kit asked. Won't someone see it? Look up there, I said, pointing at a place several feet over the fire where the smoke dissolved. You don't get much smoke with dry wood. Kit looked at Hal. Bet you didn't know that. Hal squinted his eyes at Kit. You better watch your mouth, he said. We both knew he didn't mean it and smiled. We rolled up our pant legs and thrashed through the shallow pond until all the fish were corralled at one end. I speared about 6 bass that together were enough to feed the 3 of us and have some left over for later. As I tried for the last fish, Hal tripped over something in the muddied water, and then he fell. He went completely under and then exploded back up, yelling. He thought he had been tripped, and I saw Kit's eyes grow wide when Hal charged at him. No, Hal, I said. No, Kit yelled. I hurried out of the way as both of them crashed beneath the surface. Snapper got excited too, sprung to his feet and launched himself into the water with them. Before long, the 2 of them fell and tripped and laughed their way to the bank with Snapper leaping up at their faces. As the forest grew dark, the 4 of us watched the fish. Cooking on a spit, I rigged for more of the green hickory branches. A breeze slipped through the trees at the top of the ravine. Kit and Hal sat wrapped in their blankets and stared at the food, their uniforms and jackets draped over a rack I had made near the fire to dry them out. Snapper lay between them with his chin on the ground and his jowls flayed out. He moved only his eyeballs to watch my hands tend the fish. How did fish that big get in that pond? Kit asked. They swam, stupid, Hal grumbled. They come in when it floods, I said. Shut up, Hal. Hal raised his hand from beneath the blanket and held it above Kit's head like he's going to hit him. But he didn't, and he put his hand back down. Kit looked at me, and his eyes burned with mischief. You like this, Kit? He nodded. How about you, Hal? Hal shrugged. Better than going to Hellenweiler. When the fish were done, I stabbed 3 fillets with sticks and gave 1 to each of them. The other fillets I wrapped in one of my socks for later. Ew. Kit and Hal ate quickly. I could tell they were hungry and that the fish tasted good to them. Tomorrow we could boil water and make pine needle sassafras tea. Or pine needle or sassafras tea. Is it good? Kit asked. I nodded. Real good. We can get some mint weed and make it taste even better. We lay on our sides and watched the fire dying. A bobcat screamed in the distance. Snapper's ears twitched and a low moan came from his throat. What in the hell? Hal said, it's a bobcat, I replied. Pap said it sounds like a screaming woman. Hal and Kit looked behind themselves into the shadows. Man, I hope you can whip that thing. Hal said, won't mess with you, I said. Nothing out here will mess with you if you don't mess with it. How long till we go to Alaska, Kit asked. I shrugged my shoulders. Well, I guess we'll go when y'all learn about living in the forest. Alaska's a long way, Hal said. Yeah, Kit replied. But there's more people like Moon up there. It's a place where they won't chase them. Isn't that right, Moon? That's what Pap says. What do you think they're going to do to us if they catch us, Moon? Hal asked. They're not going to catch us. That Sanders fellow seems pretty mad at you. I never seen somebody act like that over a couple of people running away. Well, he might be mad about me whipping up on him. Well, he's plenty pissed for some reason. Anybody that doesn't know you can't just set a bloodhound loose to run after his nose. Anybody that doesn't know you can't just set a bloodhound loose to run after his nose. Can't be too smart. Why is that? Because bloodhounds aren't mean by nature like some other dogs. You got to keep them on a leash and let them take you to whatever they're tracking, or else they run off. How you know about bloodhounds? I know all about all kinds of animals. I got animal books back at the shelter. I got tree books and plant books and trap books. Pap's got about 100 wrapped in a garbage bag under the spice shelf. My daddy never did learn to read good, Hal said. He's so drunk most of the time he could barely even see. Is that why they sent you to Pinson, Hal? Kit asked. Hal shook his head. Nah, I lived with my mama. She ran off and took me with her when I was 11. We lived in a place called Elrod for a while. I got in a lot of trouble stealing and stuff, so they took me away from her, said she couldn't control me, but I never did like living with her. I didn't want anything else other than be back with my daddy. Oh, you said he was drunk all the time, Kit said. That didn't matter none to me. He was still the best daddy you could have. We lived outside a little town called Union, and we'd hunt and fish and work on the truck together, just hang around the clay pit. It wasn't his clay pit, but he looked after it for the owner and took the money from people coming to get truckloads of dirt. We had a trailer parked up on the edge of it, and when it rained for a couple of days, that pit got a little water in the bottom. Come dark, Daddy'd take me outside where we had some chairs set up. He'd tell me how lucky we were to have waterfront property. Looked like a lake in the moonlight. After a while, he'd finish whatever he was drinking and then throw it out into the lake, and it'd stab into the mud and seem like it was floating. Y'all just sit out there and watch those bottles? We'd be out. We'd watch for a while. Wouldn't be long before Daddy'd get to shooting. Likes to shoot bottles. Sometimes we'd line a bunch of them at the edge of the pit and just blow them to pieces. Man, I'd like that, I said. Shooting bottles? Hal stared into the fire. He said I was his best friend. He cried when I left with Mama. I didn't like seeing him cry. My pap was my best friend too, I said. I cried when I knew he was dying. We were all quiet for a few minutes. An owl called from down the ravine. Hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo. I just remember the hospitals I was in. Kit said into the fire. I got to be friends with a couple of the nurses and doctors, but I'd always have to move on to another hospital or boys' home. Kit looked up at me. I've been in a lot of places besides Pinson. I used to live at Crichton Children's Hospital in Delaware until they found I had an aunt in Alabama. They sent me down here to live with her, but by the time the paperwork was done and I was on the bus, she was dead. She died while you were on the bus? Hal said. Kit nodded. That's right. I got to Birmingham and I stayed at the hospital there while they decided what to do with me. I got sick again and ended up staying for a year. They stuck me in the back with needles. They gave me medicine that made my hair fall out. They said I almost died. When the doctors decided that I was better, they sent me to George Jenkins Boys Home in Montgomery. And it was the worst place I'd ever stayed. But anything was better than the shots at the hospital. George Jenkins didn't have air conditioning, and it was stuffed full of boys in a bunk room with no windows. You could hear people breathing at night like they had honey in their throats and were about to choke. When you'd wake up in the morning, sweat, soaked your bed. After 6 months, I got sick again. They sent me back to Birmingham. I stayed in the hospital another year before I was better, and they sent me to Pinson. He's what they call property of the state, Hal said. Well, so are you, said Kit. Yeah, but you're the real thing. Kit's face grew tight with frustration. No more real than you, Hal. You're not anybody's property now. I interrupted. Neither of you are. That's right, Hal. I'm not anybody's property. Hal leaned back on his elbow and spit to the side. Whatever. Kit looked at me. We're still going to Alaska, right? You haven't changed your mind, have you? Of course we're going to Alaska, I said. Soon as we get you two trained and get supplies. I figured we'd made close to 5 miles today. We'd have gone farther if there weren't so many hills. Tomorrow, we'll walk some more to get far away from Sanders. We can start making camp tomorrow late afternoon. I wonder how big this forest is, Kit said. We haven't seen a road or heard a car since the fire tower. It's a national forest, Hal said. They're about as much woods as you can find anywhere. Are you going to build a shelter like that one you lived in, Kit said. No, we'll do that when we get to Alaska. I got other kind in mind for here. Kit smiled to himself. He rolled into his blanket and stared at the sky like he was thinking of Alaska. Hal and I watched the fire for a while without speaking. I thought about what Kit had said about all those places he had lived and of Hal not getting to see his pap. Hal? I said. Yeah? You got any paper in your pockets? What for? Pap said I could write him letters and burn them and he'd read the smoke. Pfft. That's the stupidest thing I'd ever heard of. No, I don't have any. You never heard of that? No. You ever heard of that, Kit? Kit shook his head. No, but that doesn't mean it won't work. Man, you two are screwed up, Hal said. I'm going to sleep. I got up and put my blanket over the clothes so that they wouldn't collect any more moisture from the air that night. What are you going to sleep with? Kid asked. I'll be okay with just my clothes. Pfft, Hal grunted disapprovingly. I stretched out by the fire again and put my hands by my head. Hal, I said. What? Hey, maybe you could teach me some good cuss words sometime, and I'll say them to Sanders. You ain't saying nothing to Sanders while I'm around. I'll whip up on him then. No, you won't. Go to sleep.